Okay. So, hello everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be talking to you all today. My presentation today is based largely on my research. I did my PhD in this area, and so I presented at a few conferences, but this is my research in its entirety. So I'm really excited to be able to share that with you. What I'm going to be unpacking in the presentation is a bit of background and context. So how this presentation and or research piece came about, locating myself in the picture, a bit of background on me, and then linking into what I sought to discover and what are some of the really interesting areas in terms of resilience and recovery from trauma that I'm able to share with you today. So first, a snapshot of me. I am originally from Melbourne, Australia, and I am registered with the Australian Association of Social Workers. I came into social work slightly later in my life. I was in my early 30s, and it snowballed into this amazing career. So I then went on to complete a PhD in the area of trauma and resilience, also with an Australian university. And my experiences in Southeast Asia were vast, and one of the organisations that is part of this research is Hagar International. And as part of a university social work, it was a unit of study, I went to Cambodia. And I was very fortunate because during this study, I became aware of NGOs working in the field that were doing some amazing work. So I did a small piece of research with Hagar International to begin, where I started to talk to their social workers and people that were working with traumatized young people in the field of Cambodia about their concept of resilience and about recovery. Simultaneously, I relocated to Thailand, where I was working as a trauma therapist. And in this inpatient treatment setting, our clients came from all over the world. So my interest in trauma and resilience was both from an academic perspective, but also from a practical side of working alongside trauma survivors myself. And that is what formed my research question. What aids resilience, and also what is resilience, because it's quite the buzzword. I've also currently work with corporate and many organisations globally, and there is so much focus on resilience in the context of the pandemic and how we all need to bounce back from burnout. And I feel like some of that messaging is damaging. And I feel like resilience doesn't necessarily look like this shiny, happy picture of wellness. So I was really curious as to find out, what does recovery and resilience look like in Cambodia? And for those of you that are familiar with the Cambodian language, you might be aware of this. There is no such word as resilience in they do have a word, resilience, but it means pressure on rubber, or the durability of rubber. So not in the psychological term that we know it as. So the term resilience was actually not used in any of my interview questions for that reason. So some of you might have a very apt understanding of the history and background of Cambodia, and others not so much. So I'm going to try to do this justice in a very short amount of time by giving you some context of Cambodia. Now, one of the major factors that emerged in the context of trauma is the genocide. So Cambodia experienced a genocide for 2 years between 75 and 79, but during that time, it's estimated that 1.5 to 2 million Cambodians lost their life. Now, as the country went about recovering, they faced a civil war. So there were lots of historical factors that have created a landscape of intergenerational trauma. Now, my research participants all were born post-KR. They are the next generation. And in terms of intergenerational trauma, this can be compounded. So parents that have experienced a genocide, that have been traumatized, are raising children. That, coupled with Cambodia being one of the poorest countries in Asia, even though it's been able to lift itself out of, well, the United Nations says that the poverty line is $1.25 a day. And so some have been able to lift themselves out of poverty, but it might only be by a couple of dollars a week. What we see in terms of poverty and gender and that intersection is there isn't as much focus on education for women. That is one area. And part of that is historical. It is a deeply patriarchal society. And also when the genocide occurred, the Khmer Rouge systematically went about targeting people with education. So a lot of those who lost their life or who immigrated to safety as refugees, I should say, and also immigrated elsewhere, was the Cambodian educated population group. And so recovering from that has been seen in the previous generations. So what has happened now is that this baby boom post-genocide that occurred and civil war, where 65% of the population is under the age of 30. So job scarcity then affects immigration for employment. And when we see this movement of people from rural communities to the big cities and also to neighbouring countries for employment, we see a vulnerable population. We see that, in particular, women can be highly vulnerable to trafficking, as to with children. I'm just seeing the chat box come up, and I'm just going to see, it's just a question. All right. Sorry, now I've moved my chat box into the middle of the page. Just give me a moment. Right. So, breakdown of the research. I went about wanting to get an understanding of resilience and recovery from a variety of sources. I had a pre-existing relationship with Hagar International, so they were very central in my research. Hagar works globally with survivors of trafficking and modern-day slavery. I wanted a different perspective, and This Life Cambodia does a lot of community-based programs that the ones that I spoke to, the young people who came from this NGO, had served time in adult jails as children. So often having a history of early childhood trauma there. Flame Cambodia works with children in the slums and has a focus on education. Flame came into my research as they employed a lot of Hagar staff. So children that had been supported by Hagar had now grown up and were working with Flame. So Flame became quite central in my research as a result of these young people. Now, coming down to diversity, when I say young people, I mean aged 18 to 30. The youngest participant I spoke to was 19. The majority were in their late 20s. And that was rather intentional in the recruitment process, as I wanted young people who had a significant chunk of time, so to speak, that's not the academic term, but distance between their actual trauma and talking to me. Also, if we're looking at resilience over the lifespan, having those that were slightly older and able to reflect back as to what was really helpful for their resilience. And also This Life Cambodia, a lot of these young people spent much of their schooling years in prison, whereas Hagar's young people, many of them had access to education, so some holding multiple degrees. And so we saw a difference in gender and education level. And the family background, only one was born in a big city. Everyone else had a rural experience. And this is very synonymous with the country context that I was describing before. Many had grown up in poverty in rural communities, and that did link them together. But their experiences after that, in terms of sexual violence and other traumas that they had experienced, differed. Now, religious affiliations, both Hagar and Flame are Christian NGOs, and This Life Cambodia is secular. And this was important to me because I very much wanted to look at spirituality as one of the factors that may underpin resilience. So I wanted a variety. So Cambodia is a Buddhist country, but I knew from my experiences with Hagar that a lot of their young people had found Christianity through their early life. So that was important to have a range of participants to really seek to understand, to seek to understand what resilience might look like. And I want to sort of deconstruct resilience here in terms of using a story from one of my participants. So one of the remarkable young people that I spoke to was born in Cambodia. His grandfather died in his early years, and he did not have any family to support him. He spent a number of years on the streets. He believes at one point he may have been in Vietnam because he speaks fluent Vietnamese. He experienced a lot of different types of trauma, violence, abuse during those years. Then he was supported by another NGO in the field, but he kept running away, he tells me, because at that point he'd been using drugs and substances, and said part of his survival was being able to form a group with several other boys and essentially fight for his life on the streets. But he said to me he made a decision that he wanted a life that his grandfather would have been proud of. So enter Hagar International. He stayed with this NGO, and he had some access to education. Trauma manifests in different ways, and one is certainly behavioural issues. So it's not about these teenage years that, being well supported, he was able to recover easily. He had behavioural issues. He used violence as a means of communicating through his teenage years, and was almost expelled from school due to behavioural issues. He had a teacher at that point fight for him to remain in his education, and he taught himself how to read at the age of 14. The man that I spoke to is a doctor, and he works with Flame and supports other young people who have gone through some of the trauma that he experienced as a child. He was also, when I spoke to him, in his final years of studying surgery. And this is just one of so many amazing stories of survival and recovery and resilience that I captured in my research. But sometimes resilience, and here is the deconstruction. First of all, Maston. She's amazing. For those of you that are in the area of psychology, chances are you know who Maston is. I really like this definition of resilience because it talks about this adaptation rather than this bouncing back to this picture of perfection. Many of the young people I spoke to still struggled with anger, still struggled with moments of extreme sadness. There was one woman I spoke to had a deep distrust of men for very, very good reasons based on her entire experience with men in her life. Now, that meant that she was not going to have a relationship and avoided men at every turn. So therefore, in this, we're not saying now life is picture perfect. It is in this adaptation. It is in this growth. It is in this learning process. And I think there's something in that for all of us, because it's not about that bounce back. It is about this constant adaptation to different scenarios throughout the course of our life. So what did underpin their recovery? This, for my psychologists or psych-minded people in the room, will not come as a surprise to you: social connection. Humans need humans. It's that simple. And whether that is, war, torture, and trauma resilience, we just need each other. And what I saw with my group of young people that I interviewed was all of them had a stable and secure connection from 0 to 2. But then all of them had these stories of one significant adult in their teenage years saying something along the lines of, "I believe in you." And that might have been through the NGOs. It might have been a counsellor or a family member, or meeting another trauma survivor and connecting through their experiences. That was peppered right through their stories of survival. Was, I've found one person I trust, I can talk to, that supports me. Meaning making. What I saw was this incredible ability to construct meaning in the darkness. Sometimes it was through faith. Sometimes it was through their connection to faith-based communities. Sometimes it was through wanting to work with other survivors. A lot of these young people are now working with other trauma survivors. And Jung coined the term wounded healers in terms of a psychotherapist who works with that works with people as a psychotherapist in order to heal their own wounds. I saw that by way of meaning making very strongly in the research participant stories. Now, opportunities for education and employment. This Life Cambodia provides job skills and training. Hagar has connected with schools and universities for their young people. Flame's whole focus is education, because this is key in Cambodia. I was really surprised by the amount of English spoken with very young Khmer in my travels. I spent 1.5 years living in Cambodia. And part of the reason for that is many people are very much focused now on education and employment opportunities. Of course they are. But in the context of poverty and rural living, where there is not a lot of schools and not a focus on education, this is hard. Many people, many young people need to fight for this. And as much as I spoke to this incredible group, there are many that fall through the cracks. And there are NGOs all across Cambodia that are doing some great work in this area. Coping with challenging emotions. I gave the snapshot of one participant's story, but this emerged. A deep distrust of the most people, also anger, sometimes substance use. Sometimes feelings of disconnection from their community. Many participants spoke about stigma, which came up in the previous session, which I was really enjoying listening to. Stigma can absolutely derail someone's recovery from trauma. And one of the areas that I saw was for the orphans in my group. There were many orphans that had no family members, and they felt often judged by their communities. They felt that they were rejected by their communities. And some of them had gone through such an incredible trauma in their childhood, but when they talked about that stigma and that rejection and that feeling of being unloved, many of them had tears in their eyes. So this links back into social connection. When a trauma survivor is supported, often by other trauma survivors that say it's okay to have these emotions, it's okay to have had these lived experiences, I see you, I hear you, and there is that connection, that's when recovery takes place. When someone remains disconnected from their wider community, this is obviously going to pose problems for those working with trauma survivors. All right, so just finally, I have written a number of articles. So for those of you that would like to perhaps check out some of the articles on ResearchGate, so this captures my entire research process and all the different areas that have emerged from my research. I have different articles on, and I'd love to continue this conversation with you by opening up to any questions or comments that you may have. I'm going to minimize my screen now and come back to the main room. Oh, there we go. And I can see the chat box clearly, possibly. Maybe. Here we go. Right. So any questions or comments?
I'll ask you a question while we're waiting for somebody else. Did you find that religiosity or spirituality had some sort of mitigating effect on resiliency?
Yes, yes. The short answer is yes. It's one of my objectives was to look at that, and the Hagar and Flame participants were found solace in their faith-based communities. A lot of them were using language such as "I'm on God's path," before I'd even asked any questions about faith and spirituality. So for some of them, it was a primary focus, and how they constructed meaning from their experiences was in helping of others and also faith and God. The Buddhist participants were less religious because of the Cambodian, no, actually, I don't want to say that. They didn't speak to Buddhism being profound in their path of resilience, but that is also because they were young men in this group, in my Buddhist group. And when I inquired, and I'm going to share a quote because this is one of my favorite quotes from one of the young Buddhist participants. I said, "So what does Buddhism mean to you?" And he said, "Well, you respect your parents and you do good deeds, and then there's a little bit of magic." and I have an article called "God and a Little Bit of Magic." Because for me, it was more, my understanding of how it helped these people was not so much in what was believed, but more how they found solace in that. And also what I heard was lots of stories about emotional regulation that linked back into reading the Bible, or discussions with their pastor, or other factors that helped them learn to manage those negative emotions that were still present in their life.
Thank you.
Great question. Thank you.
If nobody else is going to ask you questions, I'm going to keep going. I'm very interested in Cambodia as well. I've been there, lived there. I've served with a lot of people who are Cambodian. I have a number of Cambodian students here. And I'm concerned, of course, about mental health services in Cambodia. Since you've been there probably longer than I have been, what do you see as the greatest barriers to mental health services in that country?
There's the financial constraints. The vast majority of mental health services are being run by NGOs. So there's been social work standards being put in place. There has been more of a government focus, but for the purpose of my research, I looked into Rwanda because, of course, Rwanda had the genocide, and a lot of their mental health services, from trauma groups to incredible amount of government resources, have been put into that recovery from trauma. But that unfortunately hasn't happened in Cambodia. So one of the reasons we're seeing that intergenerational trauma is because it's just been flowing through, coupled with poverty factors and ongoing trauma, particularly for women in Cambodia. So I think the biggest issue is funding. Who funds these services? So what I saw as well is that a lot of the NGOs that I was linked with have been at the coalface of putting in these supports for young people and providing opportunities and access to education. And that is really how you lift people out of poverty and start to see, you know, community or systemic change there. So it is happening, but it's happening slowly. And I think as well, do I have time for a little example? I've just So in working as a trauma therapist in Thailand, like a lot of Asian culture, often don't like to be very open with their feelings and emotions. And here's the Australian and the American talking to each other right now. So Western culture is a lot more, this is how I feel and I'm reflecting on my feelings, whereas even some of my Thai friends, no, it takes them a long time to trust and to talk about that kind of content with you, especially as a foreigner. Whereas in Cambodia, I found that people were really open with me. And my language teacher, who I became very good friends with, I had this conversation with her early on in the piece. And I said, I'm finding that in Cambodia, people are a lot more open about their story and their emotions than what I'd experienced in Thailand. Because in Thailand, as a foreigner, trust is earned and it's a slow process. And she said, because it's different here, because everybody knows everybody in my community. So I might go to a doctor who will tell someone, who will tell my mother while I was there. And she said, but you, I can tell you all of my secrets, and who are you going to tell?
You can't even speak the language well.
Which was excellent for research purposes, because people were actually prepared to talk to me about their lives. And a lot of the Khmer that I spoke to actually really enjoyed the process. They said afterwards, because I used a timeline, I didn't have a chance to talk methodology, otherwise that was another half an hour session. But I used a timeline to capture their lives and their stories. And they, after going through the process, they said, I've never seen my life in that way before, and no one's asked me these questions, because my focus was not on the what happened. It wasn't on the trauma. It was what helped you in your life. And they were really happy to engage with that. And it was a beautiful process, I think, especially for me. I felt very privileged.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, Akun Charanna, appreciate your work here, and you did a fantastic job. Thank you. And that's the end of our session. That's all three of us. So goodbye, everybody. Aloha.